President Trump's moves to freeze foreign aid, Caitlin, what's happened?
Yeah, Kate, what had happened in the Trump administration is they turned off money going to nonprofits and contractors on foreign aid, people that were working.
The Supreme Court delivered a landmark 6-3 ruling in Learning Resources, Inc. versus Trump that fundamentally reshaped the landscape of presidential authority over trade policy during the second Trump administration. At the heart of this decision lies a staggering figure that captures the sheer magnitude of what was at stake: approximately $130 billion in tariff revenue now hanging in legal limbo. This amount represents the tariffs collected under the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, or IEEPA, which the court determined the president lacked the statutory authority to impose as blanket measures on imports from nearly every trading partner. The ruling struck down the broad emergency tariffs aimed at addressing issues like drug trafficking from countries such as Canada, Mexico, and China, as well as the so-called reciprocal tariffs targeting trade deficits across the globe. Only narrower, more traditional trade actions remained intact, leaving the administration's centerpiece economic strategy for the second term in significant disarray. Chief Justice John Roberts authored the majority opinion, emphasizing that any sweeping exercise of executive power over tariffs requires clear and explicit congressional authorization. The Constitution vests the power to lay and collect taxes, duties, imposts, and excises squarely in Congress under Article 1, Section 8. The framers deliberately placed this authority with the legislative branch to ensure democratic accountability, preventing the executive from unilaterally reaching into the pockets of the American people or businesses without legislative backing. IEEPA, enacted in 1977, grants the president tools to regulate international economic transactions during declared national emergencies stemming from unusual and extraordinary foreign threats. However, the court held that this language does not extend to imposing tariffs of unlimited amount, duration, or scope. The majority rejected the administration's expansive interpretation, noting that regulate importation does not equate to the power to tax imports through duties. No prior president had read IEEPA so broadly to authorize tariffs, and the statute contains no explicit reference to tariffs or duties. This categorical rejection marked a significant check on executive overreach in economic policy. The decision carried cross-ideological weight, with Roberts joined by Justices Sotomayor, Kagan, and Jackson from the left, alongside Gorsuch and Barrett, two conservative justices appointed during the first Trump term. This 6-3 split underscored that the limits on presidential power here transcended typical partisan divides. Dissenting justices argued for a more deferential view of emergency authorities, but the majority prevailed in insisting that major policy shifts involving taxation demand explicit congressional approval rather than vague statutory language that could be stretched indefinitely. The ruling applied not only to the fentanyl-related tariffs of 25% on most Canadian and Mexican imports and 10% on Chinese goods, but also to the broader reciprocal tariffs applied to imports from virtually all trading partners. These measures had been justified under emergency declarations tied to public health crises from drug inflows and persistent trade imbalances that allegedly hollowed out American manufacturing. Yet the court found that such unbounded actions exceeded the bounds of IEEPA, even in the face of genuine policy concerns. Immediately following the ruling, President Trump addressed the public, asserting that the decision actually demonstrated his strength and power while labeling the justices who ruled against him a disgrace to the nation. This response highlighted a striking contrast between public messaging and the substantive legal setback, claiming victory while simultaneously attacking the court and cherry-picking elements from dissenting opinions to suggest retained authority, revealed an acknowledgement of the ruling's constraints. The majority had explicitly rejected the notion of unlimited unilateral tariff imposition, yet the administration's framing sought to minimize the impact. Such rhetoric echoed patterns seen in prior interactions with the judiciary, where public criticism of named judges sometimes correlated with heightened online threats or polarized discourse. In this case, branding Supreme Court justices a disgrace after a high-profile defeat escalated concerns about institutional tensions between the executive and judicial branches. The practical fallout from the decision is immense. Over $130 billion in already collected tariff revenue sits in government accounts, but its legal foundation has been undermined. Businesses and importers who paid these duties under now invalidated authority have strong arguments for refunds, potentially with interest. Lower courts, including the Court of International Trade, have begun addressing these claims, with some rulings directing the government to repay importers. Estimates suggest the total exposure could climb toward $175 billion or more, depending on how broadly refunds are applied across the millions of shipments affected. This creates significant fiscal uncertainty for the federal budget, as refunding such sums could equate to a major economic stimulus or, conversely, a substantial hit to revenue projections. The tariffs, paid ultimately by American importers and often passed on to consumers through higher prices, functioned as a form of taxation. Imposing them without clear congressional approval invoked the historical principle of taxation without representation, a foundational democratic grievance that resonated with the plaintiffs, small businesses, and even some states who challenged the measures in court. This taxation without representation framing underscores the deeper constitutional stakes. The American system demands that taxes, including duties on imports, flow through legislative processes to ensure accountability to voters. Unilateral executive tariffs bypass that, concentrating power in ways the framers explicitly sought to avoid. The Supreme Court's insistence on clear congressional authorization reinforces separation of powers, preventing emergency statutes from becoming blank checks for transformative economic policies. In the context of IEEPA, the law was designed for targeted responses to foreign threats like sanctions or asset freezes, not for rewriting broad trade policy through indefinite tariffs. The court's analysis delved into statutory text, historical usage, and constitutional structure, concluding that delegating such core taxing authority would require far more explicit language than IEEPA provides. Beyond the immediate tariff context, the ruling establishes a precedent with far-reaching implications for other executive actions in the second term. Analysts point to potential challenges against attempts to influence Federal Reserve monetary policy through political pressure or executive orders seeking to alter birthright citizenship under the 14th Amendment. In both areas, aggressive unilateral moves would likely face scrutiny under the same clear statement requirement. The Federal Reserve's statutory independence shields it from direct executive control over interest rates or other decisions. Similarly, reinterpreting constitutional citizenship provisions via executive fiat lacks congressional backing and implicates fundamental rights. The tariff decision signals that courts will demand explicit legislative support for major policy overhauls, curbing reliance on emergency declarations or shadow docket maneuvers to enact sweeping changes without Congress. This principle, no more massive policy overhauls without Congress, represents a bipartisan institutional signal. A 6-3 majority, including Trump-appointed justices, indicates the court is drawing lines around executive power even when the administration has reshaped the judiciary. It limits strategies that use emergencies to bypass democratic legislative processes, forcing greater reliance on Congress for ambitious agendas. Internationally, allies and partners viewed the ruling as evidence of American institutional resilience, a check on perceived overreach that reassures global observers about the stability of U.S. governance. Foreign governments saw it as proof that domestic checks can restrain unilateral actions affecting worldwide trade, potentially easing tensions over disrupted supply chains and retaliatory measures. Delving deeper into the fiscal dimensions, the $130 billion in limbo highlights immediate economic ripple effects. Tariff collections under the invalidated measures contributed substantially to federal revenue in a short period, but their sudden legal invalidation opens the door to refund litigation on a massive scale. Importers, ranging from small businesses to large corporations, have filed thousands of claims in the Court of International Trade seeking repayment. These refunds, if granted broadly, could inject liquidity back into the economy, benefiting importers but straining Treasury resources. The uncertainty affects budgeting, trade planning, and consumer prices, as businesses reassess costs previously inflated by the duties. Some analyses suggest the effective stimulus from potential refunds could rival major fiscal packages, altering economic forecasts for growth, inflation, and deficits. On the statutory front, the IEEPA interpretation narrows presidential tools in future emergencies. While the law retains value for non-tariff measures like blocking transactions or freezing assets, it cannot serve as a vehicle for broad taxation. This forces the administration to explore alternative authorities, such as Section 122 of the Trade Act of 1974, which allows limited tariff adjustments, but with procedural constraints and narrower scope. Early post-ruling moves included implementing a 10% global tariff under this alternative, though it faces its own legal and practical limits compared to the sweeping IEEPA approach. The ruling thus channels executive trade policy toward more conventional, congressionally supported mechanisms, potentially slowing the pace of aggressive unilateralism. The broader accountability story ties into the midterm electoral landscape. The tariffs were sold as a means to make America rich again by protecting domestic industries and generating revenue. Their judicial invalidation undercuts that narrative, raising questions for voters in competitive districts about the effectiveness and legality of the approach. GOP incumbents who championed the policy may face scrutiny if economic disruptions or refund battles highlight costs to consumers and businesses. Conversely, the decision could bolster arguments for legislative reform, encouraging Congress to clarify or expand trade authorities in ways that balance executive flexibility with democratic oversight. Watch for refund litigation outcomes, alternative tariff strategies, extensions of the clear authorization precedent to other power claims, and electoral signals in 2026 races as key indicators of the ruling's lasting impact. In sum, the Supreme Court in Learning Resources Inc. versus Trump ruled 6-3 that IEP does not authorize the president to impose tariffs, rejecting claims of unlimited unilateral authority over imports. Over $130 billion in collected revenue now faces refund pressures under the taxation without representation critique. Trump's podium reaction, claiming it proved his power while attacking the justices, underscored the gap between spin and legal reality. The clear congressional authorization requirement sets a high bar for future executive economic actions, constraining Federal Reserve pressures, birthright citizenship efforts, and similar initiatives. Allies abroad interpreted it as institutional strength reigning in overreach. This nuke move on the second-term economic agenda pillar forces a recalibration toward legislative engagement, with profound fiscal, constitutional, and political consequences unfolding in the months and years ahead. The decision's technical nature belies its profound significance. It reaffirms foundational principles. Congress controls the purse, emergencies do not erase separation of powers, and major questions of policy require explicit delegation. For businesses, the ruling offers relief from unpredictable duties, enabling more stable supply chain planning. For consumers, it may moderate price pressures tied to tariff costs. For the administration, it necessitates creative navigation of remaining authorities while testing the boundaries of the new precedent. Legal experts anticipate a wave of follow-on cases as parties probe refund mechanics, alternative frameworks, and applications to non-trade contexts. The cross-ideological majority lends legitimacy, signaling that constitutional limits apply regardless of political winds. Expanding on the international dimension, trading partners monitored the case closely. Retaliatory tariffs or trade disputes had escalated amid the U.S. measures, disrupting global commerce. The court's intervention de-escalates some tensions by invalidating the broadest actions, though replacement measures could reignite frictions. European and Asian allies particularly welcomed the restraint, viewing it as validation of rules-based trade norms over unilateral fiat. Domestically, the ruling intersects with ongoing debates over executive power in national security and economic emergencies. It draws a line against converting temporary crisis tools into permanent policy levers, preserving Congress's role in setting long-term trade strategy. Economically, the tariffs had mixed effects: revenue generation versus higher input costs for manufacturers, retaliatory barriers for exporters, and inflationary pressures. Striking them down removes one variable but introduces refund uncertainties and policy pivots. Fiscal models project that full refunds could exceed combined annual spending in key departments, forcing difficult budgetary choices or offsets. Businesses that absorbed or passed on costs now seek restitution, potentially spurring investment or debt reduction. The decision also prompts reflection on tariff policy design. Targeted, congressionally approved measures may prove more sustainable than broad emergency impositions. Philosophically, the case revives debates from the founding era about executive versus legislative primacy in fiscal matters. Madison and others warned against concentrating taxing power in one branch, lest it erode Republican safeguards. The court's opinion echoes Federalist concerns, prioritizing textual fidelity and historical practice over functionalist arguments for broad executive latitude in a complex world. Even in an age of globalization and rapid threats, the Constitution's structure demands accountability. This holding will influence not just trade but analogous areas where statutes grant emergency powers, urging Congress to draft clearer delegations or retain tighter oversight. As developments continue, key watch points include how aggressively refund claims proceed, whether the administration successfully pivots to other statutes without triggering further litigation, how lower courts apply the clear authorization test to pending challenges, and whether the ruling influences voter perceptions of governance competence and rule of law. The tariff saga illustrates the interplay of all three branches: executive initiative, legislative framework, and judicial review. In this instance, the judiciary reasserted boundaries, compelling a more collaborative path forward. The outcome, while disruptive in the short term, may foster more durable and constitutionally sound economic policies over time. Ultimately, this episode reinforces that no single branch holds unchecked sway. The $130 billion figure crystallizes the stakes, vast sums tied to contested authority now subject to repayment and reevaluation. Trump's contradictory response, blending triumph with denunciation, captures the human element amid institutional friction. The precedent of clear congressional authorization stands as a bulwark against overreach, applicable across the second term's ambitions. International observers gain confidence in American self-correction mechanisms. For citizens, it underscores the enduring relevance of constitutional design in navigating contemporary challenges. The full ramifications will emerge through litigation, legislation, and elections, but the core message is clear. Sweeping unilateral tariffs under IEPA are off the table, redirecting the economic agenda toward more constrained, accountable channels. This shift promises a more deliberate trade policy landscape, balancing urgency with democratic norms in ways that honor the nation's foundational commitments.